The Chicago Bears are looking for Cole Kmet to take another step forward this season, but for me, it raises questions of just how high his ceiling might be.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. On the show today, we explore Cole Kmet's present and future with the Chicago Bears and kind of get into this idea of what we should be expecting from him, not only in 2022, but beyond. Where's that ceiling? The shadow of Jimmy Graham is gone, and it's really the Cole Kmet show at tight end with a couple of other veterans behind him who we will also get to on the podcast today. We'll look at some of his skill set and what that could lead to for Cole Kmet and compare it, last year with this idea that he wasn't really given opportunities to score touchdowns as to when he had 0 touchdowns last season. And we'll kind of look at how that projection worked last season and what we could then expect this season in presumably better hands in terms of offensive coordinator and possibly and more likely more consistency at the quarterback position. Because I think we want to see Cole Kmet elevate into this, difference maker at the tight end position. And even last year with Jimmy Graham in the offense, he was still the top tight end and still had a solid season of production. 60 catches, a little over 600 yards. You got your 10 yards per reception, and was able to be not always like a chain mover, but a reliable go-to option for Fields and Dalton and even Nick Foles at one stretch of the season. And as much as we in Chicago, I think you get Bears fans with a lot of pessimism about Cole Kmet on both sides of the spectrum, also some optimism. But he was 16th in receiving yards among tight ends last season. So it wasn't as though he's already a top 16 guy. It wasn't though he was at the bottom of the spectrum exactly for tight end production. But of course, 0 touchdowns. No tight end last season had over 400 yards without a touchdown, except for Cole Kmet. Dan Arnold from the Jaguars hit 408 and no touchdowns, but he's the next tight end after Cole Kmet in terms of production. Everybody else had touchdowns, and so we can presumably think those numbers will come up a little bit this season, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But as far as the skill set goes, and Cole Kmet's ceiling, right? We're never going to expect him to become like Kyle Pitts in Atlanta, where you could almost mistake him for an oversized wide receiver. Cole Kmet is big, thick, long, strong, and can move humans. His run blocking has developed over the years. It wasn't like one of his super strong points coming out of Notre Dame, but he had the size and the want to, and we've seen it get better significantly, I think, from where he was as a rookie to where he is now. It's not, perfect by any means, but same thing with pass protection, right? You can count on him. He's not going to be, the best blocking tight end in the NFL, but you can count on him in that way too. And then, as a receiver, the production has slowly increased. We knew that rookie tight ends and young tight ends especially don't tend to produce early in their career unless it's, these big exceptions like a guy like Kyle Pitts, who we talked about. But he at least has done a good job, at least did at first a good job of holding on to the passes he was thrown. This past season, his drop percentage doubled. He had 5 drops, but also, he had double the catches as well. So there's a give and take there. We'd like to see him hold on to a few more passes. But what his skill set lends itself to can only go so far, right? If you're not the freak movement athlete, you might not be that true, top 5 tight end. And I don't think anybody was expecting Cole Kmet to come into the NFL and all of a sudden emerge as this top 5, 1,200 yard tight end in this offense? No. It's not fair to expect him to be Travis Kelce or whatever, but I think he can still be a lot more than what we saw this past season and can still push for a bigger role in this Bears offense, right? He's not going to be running across the middle of the field and, outrunning all the safeties and linebackers, let alone, cornerbacks across the middle of the field. But if he can, be physical and strong and catch contested catches, which is something he still needs to work on, and we're still sort of, still early in his career. We're not putting anything out there specifically like either way definitive on what he is or isn't going to be, but it's still a work in progress for him. But if he can catch the tough ones when the coverage is tight, if he can be that reliable option in the intermediate middle of the field area, that's everything you would want and hope for from a tight end. Like, you would want him to be a potential difference maker. He's never going to be a make you miss with the ball in his hands after the catch a ton, but if he can run over guys more, we have seen him run over a few guys here or there as he gets a little head of steam behind him. It starts to get you towards this image of what Cole Kmet might be able to be. I remember coming out of the draft, the main comparison we heard for him was another recent Notre Dame tight end, Kyle Rudolph, who spent a lot of his career at the Minnesota Vikings and then was with the Giants last year, and I think just like this week or last week, signed with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to team up with Tom Brady now in like his 12th season of his NFL career. And I don't think Kyle Rudolph is going to be pushing for a Hall of Fame bid or anything, but he's made a couple of Pro Bowls. I think his best season was 2016, or most productive season, we should say, was in 2016. He had 840 catches and 7 touchdowns. That seemed to be about the peak for him, but he had a handful of seasons in that 500 to 600 range with, anywhere from 4 to 8 touchdowns along there. And for a second-round pick, that would be a solid career for Cole Kmet. That's where Kyle Rudolph was also drafted in the second round, just 2011, a little bit earlier. But that seems to kind of be the path he's on. I'm not expecting that big jump to 1,000 yards or anything, but pick up where he left off last season and maybe get a few more touchdowns in there with perhaps some more opportunities to score touchdowns. We'll look at his red zone production compared to the rest of the Bears team and say how much of that last season was Matt Nagy and the quarterbacks not getting Cole Kmet the ball versus Cole Kmet not doing enough with the opportunities he did have to score. And I kind of end up getting a little bit of a fantasy football spin on this as well. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is powered by Built Bars, the world's best tasting protein bars. I mean, they are legitimately delicious. They're sweet. They taste like candy bars, but they have all the nutrients of a protein bar. So they satisfy my sweet tooth, but they're low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It's an unreal combination. They're soft, they're easy to chew, covered in 100% real chocolate, and they come in a bunch of incredible flavors. I've really been enjoying the coconut brownie chunk puff. It's almost like a coconut marshmallow covered in chocolate with actual pieces of like chocolate brownie in the bar as well. It's unreal, and I don't know how they make it so healthy and taste so good. You got to try them for yourself. Head on over to built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Last season, the big criticism of Cole Kmet, I think largely influenced by fantasy football, was his lack of touchdowns. He, like I said earlier, was the only tight end to have over 410 yards and 0 touchdowns this past season. That's not to say that plenty of other guys had only like 1 or 2 touchdowns. Kyle Pitts, who we talked about, had 1 touchdown last season. Mike Gesicki with the Dolphins had 2. Even Darren Waller from the Raiders, who was hurt for part of the season, only finished with 2 touchdowns last season. So touchdowns are not the only way to measure a tight end's ability, but it was kind of the thing that was missing from Cole Kmet was being that true like red zone weapon. And it felt so often last season like the Bears tried to force Jimmy Graham into being that red zone weapon. And I was curious how much truth there was to that. Right? It's something that we anecdotally felt and saw with our eyes and felt like a larger trend of like they would get to the red zone and then all of a sudden the Jimmy Graham package, or sometimes it was just the Jimmy Graham play where they would just snap it and throw the Jimmy Graham fade and ignore every other route on the play. It wasn't every time, but it felt often is kind of the key there. So I was curious, like, was that actually the case, or was it an anti-Jimmy Graham bias that we were carrying? I mean, Jimmy Graham was not earning the money that the Bears paid him last season, and we kind of thought that might happen from the start, but then did that make us, bias in our evaluation of both Graham and then Kmet as a result? So fortunately, our friends at Pro Football Focus have specific data on red zone and end zone use from tight ends, and I'm happy to share just the Bears section with you today, because I think it reveals a little bit about this situation last year and then what we can expect to be different as a result this season. So last season, and the nice thing about PFF is they separate it by red zone targets and end zone targets. I believe red zone targets would include end zone targets. So on their stat, red zone target is anything 20 through the end zone, and end zone would just be the section of red zone targets where the receiver is in the end zone. So it's either caught for a touchdown or it's incomplete. But you can't catch an end zone target for anything but a touchdown. And so last season, Cole Kmet had 19 red zone targets and 6 end zone targets, compared to Jimmy Graham, who had 11 red zone targets and the equal number of end zone targets at 6. The big difference is Jimmy Graham caught 2 of his end zone targets for 2 touchdowns, 2 of his 6, and Cole Kmet, of course, caught 0. Cole Kmet actually caught 9 of his red zone targets, though, 9 of his 19 total. Just none of those 9 were in the end zone, and on none of those 9 was he able to cross the end zone. So he had the second most red zone targets and tied for the third most end zone targets among Bears receivers last season. All of those numbers feel a bit low because the offense as a whole wasn't specifically getting into the red zone or throwing the ball into the end zone perhaps as much as you would like a professional football playing offense to do so. But it wasn't as though Jimmy Graham greatly outnumbered Cole Kmet. They were, again, equal in red zone or in end zone targets. They had the exact same number, and Kmet had a few more in the actual red zone. The difference there, and why we have, I think, the perception that we have, which I don't think is an inaccurate perception. I just think multiple things are true at the same time here. That Jimmy Graham last season had 11 red zone targets and 6 end zone targets, and that represented a large majority of his playing time. It was just under half of his total targets on the season. 42.9% of his catches last season came in the red zone, and 50% of his targets on the season came in the red zone. So he had 22 targets last season, 11 came in the red zone, and 6 came in the end zone. So the sort of anecdotal feeling that Bears would get down to the red zone, put in Jimmy Graham, and give him the ball was accurate based on the data, that yes, half of his targets were coming in that area. But it was also true then that Cole Kmet was also getting targets in that area. He got more red zone targets than everyone but Darnell Mooney on the Chicago Bears. And he got more end zone targets than everyone but Mooney and Allen Robinson. 6 end zone targets is not a lot, relatively speaking. Of course, there is an opportunity then to give him more of them compared to other tight ends and other offenses, right? However, when you get 6 end zone targets, you would also expect perhaps a quality starting tight end to catch at least one of them, right? That's the other side of this. I do think you can blame Matt Nagy for forcing the ball to Jimmy Graham and giving Jimmy Graham a lot of these specific targets and opportunities in the red zone and end zone. I think it's also fair to say Jimmy Graham or Cole Kmet needed to be better in the end zone. Now, of course, doesn't mean all 6 of those targets were accurate, easily catchable balls. Not all 6 were dropped passes, no, but you just think sort of over the course of statistically, chances are low that none of those 6 were catchable balls. And he even admitted there was an end zone target last season that he wasn't able to corral, that he said it still sits with him that he wishes he had that one back because that one should have been a touchdown. We look around and see Jesse James, the third string tight end, had 2 end zone targets last season and caught one of them. Jesper Horsted, the number 4 tight end who was just cut earlier this offseason, caught 2 end zone targets. Had three total end zone targets and caught 2 of them. Jimmy Graham caught 2 of 6. Allen Robinson caught 1 of 7. Darnell Mooney caught 3 of 8. no one's over here saying Cole Kmet needed to catch 5 or 6 of his 6, but probably should have caught at least 1, if not 2, when you're getting that many targets. I mean, it's just, 6 is not a lot, and it is a relative small sample size, and you could go through each of those 6 targets and probably find legitimate reasons as to why they weren't caught. So it's not purely Cole Kmet's fault either. Yet that those targets are not all created equal, and it's not fair to expect him to catch every single one or even more than a few of them. But some of it is his fault. Some of it is also Matt Nagy and the offensive scheme's fault, and just generally not even getting any players enough of those end zone targets. I mean, they got a decent number of red zone targets, but just throwing the ball either short of the goal line or not even getting close enough to the goal line to make those end zone targets more realistic. It's also worth noting that everyone else was able to convert a lot of their end zone targets was where the touchdowns came. But there weren't very many red zone targets that turned into touchdowns that weren't already in the end zone. Jimmy Graham had 1, Marquise Goodwin had 1, and then Damian Williams and Jakeem Grant also each had 1. But Darnell Mooney's 3 red zone touchdowns were all end zone touchdowns caught in the end zone. And same with Allen Robinson and Jimmy Graham and Jesper Horsted and Jesse James. Right? There weren't very many plays where the Bears were catching a pass outside of the end zone from the red zone and then crossing the goal line. So a lot of areas there where this Bears offense can take those steps forward in terms of touchdown production and help Cole Kmet's stat line become that much better and reflect more of where he is at this young stage of his career. They also have a very different cast of backup tight ends around him that are legitimately going to be competing for not only red zone targets, but playing time in general. We'll learn a little bit more about Ryan Griffin and James O'Shaughnessy and the rest of the crew heading into Bears training camp next on Locked On Bears. Training camp means football is almost here. And if you want to really make it feel like football is here, our friends at betonline.net are here to help with plenty of futures bets on this upcoming season. You could bet on the Bears win total over under 6.5. Bears odds to make the playoffs. They even have individual player props for their production up this upcoming season. David Montgomery, Justin Fields, and others to check out. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs, all your favorite sports and events, all the lines, odds, games for every league. Major League Baseball season going on right now. Looking ahead to basketball and hockey again before you know it. Combat sports, esports, golf, tennis, soccer, you name it. BetOnline is the top online resource. Any of your wagering information, live in-game betting scores, they have you covered. Head on over to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the different action happening today. BetOnline, where the game starts. The Chicago Bears overhauled some of the rest of their tight end position around Cole Kmet. I believe Kmet is the only returning tight end from last season, let alone the previous regime. And we were always used to a carousel of tight ends in Chicago each offseason under Matt Nagy, but you tended to have a lot of the same familiar faces. J.P. Holtz just never really left. He just stuck around for quite some time. And, Jesper Horsted was an undrafted free agent in 2019, so did, a full 3 seasons of the circuit here in Chicago. Jesse James was the newcomer last season, and Cole Kmet stuck around Jimmy Graham had stuck around for a couple seasons. But all of those guys gone now. A little surprised they cut Jesper Horsted in the middle of the offseason. Didn't really save any salary cap space. No, they just kind of said, not interested, I guess, or wanted to give him a better opportunity somewhere else, whatever it was. Would have still liked to continue kicking the tires on that one. But instead, in comes a couple of veterans that were moves that generally, I think, flew a bit under the radar. I mean, yes, they're backup tight ends. They're not going to not fly under they're not going to be big headline drawing acquisitions or anything like that. But I don't think we paid enough attention to Ryan Griffin in particular coming over from the New York Jets because he was a starting tight end for the New York Jets last season. I mean, he played, I think, a pretty close to the same number of snaps as Cole Kmet, in the Bears offense, is what Ryan Griffin played in the Jets offense. It only amounted to 27 catches for 261 yards and 2 touchdowns. So he's not coming in as some super productive, receiving weapon for Justin Fields necessarily, but I'll take that experience and a pretty decent blocker at that to rotate in there. I mean, he's not going to be a difference maker who takes a ton of Cole Kmet's targets. He's never had more than 450 yards in a season. Had one 5 touchdown season with the Jets, but he has a very real ceiling at this point, at this stage of his career. He's like 31. He's a experienced veteran who can hold down some of those other snaps and come in and help out with the blocking. And I wouldn't say he's like the traditional mold of like, the biggest, strongest, burliest blocking tight end, but he's long and has some ability to get his pads under you and drive people a little bit. Definitely more run blocking than pass protection, I would say, but still, I think a guy who you're going to see, I don't know if more of than you expect, but he just seems like the kind of player that you'll hear that name either in the preseason or the first couple of games and go, who's Ryan Griffin? Yeah, he's out there. Okay, the other tight end. Yeah, he's been a player in this league for a while. Like he played some serious snaps as a starter for the Texans and the Jets kind of throughout his career. The other one is James O'Shaughnessy, who also has been around the block a little bit. A longtime Jacksonville Jaguar number 2 tight end, has been a starter for them too in a pinch. Not another one of these like not uber productive type of tight ends. 24 catches, 240 yards, and no touchdowns last season, but has been in that starting type role. I believe he was hurt as well for some of last season, but definitely another one of these kind of guys that you can trust them as a blocker. You can trust that they're going to catch the ball when you throw it to them, but you're not expecting them to, take the catch and go 35, 40 yards downfield on a big, breakaway style of catch and run. But a guy who's been pretty consistent in pass protection over his career, a guy that you can rely on to help, your offensive tackles. If it's Borum and Jenkins or Braxton Jones in there, you're going to need to maybe leave those tight ends in to help chip with Justin Fields more than I think Matt Nagy and the Bears offense did last season. So they're not going to be the difference between the Bears winning and losing games, but I think there's stuff to like from both of those tight ends, and they can be reliable veteran options there that you don't want to have to rely on for anything more than number 2, number 3 type tight end roles, but you're in good hands as far as that spectrum of players go. Then there's a trio of young guys. There's Ryson John, who's been was a former undrafted free agent out of Simon Fraser, who bounced around mostly with the Giants. He was injured reserve and then practice squad, and then I think he was on the COVID list and then injured reserve. He hasn't ever played in the game. He's like in his 3rd season now, 24 years old, but clearly a developmental type guy at 6'7", like 225, 230. So he's built in more of that like long, skinny receiver type tight end role, but we just don't know what he's going to be. But seems to be maybe their preferred version of Jesper Horsted. We'll kind of see. Then 2 undrafted free agent rookies this year, Jake Tongs and Chase Allen. Given the veteran experience on this depth chart, we pretty much know it's going to be Kmet, Ryan Griffin, James O'Shaughnessy. Those will be your 3 tight ends, plus your fullback, Kari Blasingame. You could write that in your 53-man roster prediction right now in pencil. I wouldn't necessarily say pen because there's time for injuries or something else to change or a surprise suspension or whatever it might be, but that doesn't look to be much wiggle room as things stand right now at the end or towards the end here of July. But we're right around the corner from Bears players now reporting to training camp. The practices are going to begin soon. We'll be breaking it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So I hope you'll hit that subscribe button so you can keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Really appreciate you making Locked On Bears your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, go check out the Locked On NFL podcast, where we've been breaking down the top 50 most valuable players in the NFL on the betting line. Our friends at BetOnline.net have went through the odds makers and said, okay, which players move the line, the betting line, the most on games when they're healthy or in the game versus not in the game. And I'll tell you, Justin Fields cracked the top 25 on that list, but you got to listen to find out where he is. And you'll actually hear from me on that podcast talking about Fields' location, whether I felt like it's a good spot or a bad spot, or what it means that the odds makers are saying about Justin Fields. That's on the Locked On NFL podcast, wherever you find this podcast, including on YouTube as well. Appreciate you tuning in, and I hope that you'll keep coming back for more, because the Locked On Bears podcast is here to help you bear down.